afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. I'm Andres Martinez. Welcome to our conversation entitled, Is Sport the Future of Media? Brought to you by Future Tense, a collaboration between the New America think tank in DC and Arizona State University, which explores the impact of technology on society, and the Great Game Lab at ASU, which explores how sport connects us to the rest of the world, and to our fabulous students here fitting in downtown Phoenix at the Cronkite School. Talking about this relationship between sport and media couldn't be timelier. We're here at Super Bowl week. There's a lot of talk about how commercials for the Super Bowl on Sunday are up to, I don't know, $8 million for 30 seconds. And so I'm very excited to have this conversation today and to have the benefit of two extremely thoughtful and extremely experienced protagonists in this relationship between sport and media. So thank you so much, Shirin Malkani, who is co-chair of the Sports Industry Group at Perkins Coie, and Joe Ravitch, co-founder and partner of the RAIN Group. And Joe, I realize you're based in LA, so all of our thoughts have been with your community this past month. I hope your team is safe and sound, and it's really tragic what's happened in LA. But thank you for doing this with us. And Sharon, maybe we can start with you. I know it's a relationship question. It's a question about how you have seen the evolution of sports, this relationship between sports and media over the past generation. But also, if you could just sort of give us a sense of how you've intersected with that. You're in a law firm now. You spent several years at the NBA, but you're eager to hear about how you would describe this evolving relationship.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks so much for inviting me to join you all. I probably came to sports later than Joe did, as he just told us as we were chatting before this. I started my career in the 90s as a digital lawyer, really trying to figure out how the internet was going to work and how we were going to protect and monetize premium content. That's what interested me, and really the premium point there. And that's what brought me to sports. I actually was hired in 2008 as the NBA's first digital lawyer. But my first day on the job, I was on a call with my boss, Bill, who Joe also knows, and Comcast negotiating an NBA TV, the linear network affiliation agreement with Comcast. And so I think my first point there is, even in 2008, there was this intersection between digital and television. And my job at the time was to think about how to protect and monetize those digital rights. I actually moved over to the business side and spent the chunk of my 7 years at the NBA on the business side, kind of managing that full domestic portfolio of television as well as digital. And that intersection obviously was important in 2008 and even more important now. So a lot of people who do the kind of work I do often come at it from the more traditional side, which, many years ago, and when I was a kid, broadcast, that was how you watched your games. It was your local NBC, ABC affiliate. I think I imagine we'll get to talk a little bit about how local rights have come full circle in many ways and back to broadcast media. I'm starting to do broadcast deals, something I'd never done in my career before. But I think if you look at a generation ago, what was interesting was the new technology really was the pay TV bundle and cable. And some of us will remember when, like Fox started taking NFL games, or ESPN started taking NFL games, and this idea that you were taking content off of the broadly available platform of over the air and putting it behind a paywall. And at the time, that felt really potentially dangerous, right? Like, what were we saying to our fans? How are we going to reach them? And so I think you fast forward 30 years and you hear some of these same conversations now around digital platforms. What does it mean for Amazon to have Thursday night football games? And, obviously I'm leaning into the NFL here for these examples because they're considered sort of the apex of rights. And by no means does that mean that I discount the NBA as being a close number two. But so I think it's interesting to think about that evolution of starting with over-the-air broadcasts. And I think even in the intro to this panel, there were some discussions about radio, right? So you can go to radio, you can go to over-the-air broadcast, you can go to sort of cable/pay television, and now you go to streaming. And I think you're always sort of balancing these issues of reaching your fans, getting them where they are, and then monetizing the content, right? And making sure that you're maximizing that if you're a rights holder. So I imagine we're going to spend a lot of the next, 50 minutes unpacking some of those themes, but that gives you a sense of sort of how I approach it. I come to it as a digital native.
That's great. That's a great overview. And yeah, I'm old enough to remember when people were outraged that NFL games were put on ESPN. And now we're seeing another transition where people are like, you can't take them off of cable. But Joe, how do you see this evolution, and what's been your relationship with the intersection of sports and media through your career?
Well, I don't want to confess my old age as I did to Sheeran, but as an interesting example, one of the first sports transactions I dealt with was in 1996. I represented Rupert Murdoch and his pay TV company in trying to buy Manchester United Football Club. We got the intention of buying it was effectively to secure the right and control the rights to the most important soccer team in the UK, to make sure that the rights were continued to be controlled by Sky. At the time, by the way, there was no such thing as digital, but the idea was effectively starting to move games away from linear to pay television, which at the time was shocking. And incidentally, just again, as Sharon, we'll talk about it with more knowledge than myself, but we do a lot. The NBA was the first league to move from linear to pure pay, and then from pay into streaming, and they will always be, I think, at the cutting edge of sports and media in many ways. But you know, that deal was effectively done. It was rejected for antitrust reasons by the British government. But I think there is historically the value of sport is something that was unrecognized, and I think in the last 5 or 6 years, you've seen, particularly with digital, particularly with the fragmentation of audiences, particularly with streaming, you've seen the value of sport go up exponentially, as evidenced by the tripling in the recent NBA rights deals, the vast increases in the NFL, and the value of live sports in a world where it gets harder and harder to capture audiences. And you know, you need live. You need passion. You need a dedicated audience willing to effectively pay to subsidize or underwrite the cost of these events. And it's something that sport globally is benefiting from enormously and will continue to benefit from. We've seen that across the board. I started working with the UFC back when they first started. The two brothers bought the company for $2 million. It took us 10 years to get away from a pay-per-view model. We ended up on pay television with Viacom. We ended up doing a deal with Fox for linear. By the time we sold the company in 2016, it was doing 200 million of cash flow. I think it's now going to up fourfold and has become a very mainstream sport. And is probably worth $20 billion, and I sold it for $4 billion. A lot of the niche sports, whether it's surfing, boxing, MMA, you're going to continue to see interest as new streamers try to develop and find ways to create niches for themselves, whether that's DAZN, whether that's ancillary businesses of the big media companies like Bleacher Report for Warner and others. You know, I think the value of sport is only going to increase. I buy and sell a lot of teams around the world. I create a lot of leagues, and the value of these franchises has only gone up in the 30 years I've been doing this. And every time there's an economic crash, a recession, a depression, everybody comes to me and says, well, surely sports franchise values are down. And I say, no, they're actually just going up. The scarcity value is maintained, the economics increase. And I'll give you my favorite example and turn it back over to you. I was sitting recently, probably a year or two ago, with a sports commissioner for a major sports league. And they said, you know, when we planned our budget this year, we had zero money. We didn't even know what an NFT was. And we're going to make 50 million in profit from NFTs this year. We were making 7 million getting paid by a third party for our data. Instead of 7, that number is now 150 million a year. And we didn't think we could make any money from sports betting because sports betting was illegal in the United States. And then the Supreme Court came up with a completely nonsensical thesis to eliminate the rules against sports betting, declaring it unconstitutional on an argument that neither party mentioned in their briefs, frankly. And now sports betting is legal in a few states, growing obviously exponentially, because the TAM for sports betting is proving to be 10 to 20 times higher than any original estimate in every country in which it's been legalized. So even without directly getting into sports betting, the league was going to make $150 million in profit from sports betting and from selling data to betting shops and to betting providers like DraftKings and FanDuel, and Entain and others. So I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you will continue to see digital streaming and other forms of monetization benefit the IP owners in sport on a global basis. And I say global because it's incredibly important. Ironically, as sort of a funny round trip in my career, last year I sold Manchester United, which has 1.2 billion fans, 1 billion of whom are in emerging markets. And if you think about Twitter as being worth $50 billion, and I said this to Jeff Bezos and I said it to Elon Musk, if you think Twitter is worth $50 billion because it has 200 million MAUs, you know, I have 1 billion almost DAUs, people who are obsessed by Manchester United, and they're in a lot of exciting growth markets, and a lot of them are primarily only in digital markets. So what is Manchester United worth? And when I sold it for $6 billion, everybody was shocked and said how crazy the value was. I think it'll be worth double or triple that in the next 5 to 10 years, as will many other global sports teams. So I'll shut up, and I hope that's helpful to you as you guys think about these issues.
Yeah, lots to unpack. And you are next week in this class, we're talking to the head of communications for Manchester United. So that was a timely pitch for one of the things that we're really focused on is the relationship between the two footballs, how that's evolving. One of the texts that we're reading this semester in this class is The Club, about the sort of how the English Premier League became the most globalized sports league. And it's interesting that you mentioned Rupert Murdoch back in the 90s trying to acquire Manchester United. He was blocked, and yet he still was able to leverage sport to kind of validate and enable the growth of Sky TV. And this is something we've seen again and again, dating back to the 20s when radio proved itself by broadcasting a boxing match from Jersey City, the first time people in different states all were able to experience something simultaneously. We saw it when satellite TV needed to legitimize itself in the US. What did it do? It acquired the Sunday Ticket and Fox when it wanted to become a broadcast network, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things I think a lot about is, on the one hand, it's pretty obvious why live sport would be the most important sort of crown jewel to traditional linear TV, and maybe the last remaining crown jewel, right? And when I was in college, we would all get together to watch LA Law on Thursday nights. When I was in law school in particular, or we'd watch Cheers, we'd watch Seinfeld, and 25 million people would be watching those shows. Now, the only kind of programming that gets those audiences are live sport, right? I streamed Breaking Bad a couple of months ago, like 10 years behind. It was fantastic. It didn't matter that I was streaming it 10 years behind. I'm not streaming the 2014 World Cup from Brazil, right? That's something you have to experience live. But let me ask you, Sharon, are you surprised that streaming services and the tech platforms, most notably recently Netflix, but Amazon and Apple, that they also feel compelled to embrace and acquire live sports rights?
No, I think you probably, I imagine Joe would say the same thing. I mean, you're obviously talking to people who very much believe in the primacy of sports rights for, a lot of the reasons that Joe said and you sort of outlined. I mean, it is the only way left to create a sort of live community and to have a water cooler event. And, you know, the drama that comes with it, it's not just the games themselves. Like, I think about the Luka trade, right? How much cultural resonance that has. I mean, the number of people, I actually also do some work with the Mavericks who have just asked me about the Luka trade. And I bet everyone on this call has had some conversation, read an article, thought about it, the kind of cultural resonance that it has. And if you're a streamer, you're in the business of capturing and creating cultural resonance. And sure, if you're Netflix, you can have a Squid Game, but taking 2 NFL games, it's, you know, that that's going to hit, right? There's no question that you're going to get the audience, and you layer Beyonce on top of it, and the value is kind of undeniable. So I think it was just a matter of time. And once the decision is made that you're going to invest in this, and you are a streamer and you have so many other robust businesses that are generating cash for you, making these investments becomes less of an issue, right? And particularly if you have a larger business, if you're Amazon and you want to sell people goods and you've got all this data that you're gathering, if you're Google, you want to sell ads to help have other people sell goods, right? Like, it's not that hard to imagine that whatever is going to attract eyeballs and keep them engaged and do it in a mass audience way. In some ways, I think it's interesting that it took as long as it did for, say, Netflix, who had been so adamant, right, about saying they weren't interested in live sports.
Right.
And I think, you know, they've been smart about it, and people have talked about their strategy in particular as being one around events as opposed to, say, tonnage, right? Like, they didn't do an Apple MLS deal. They didn't sweep everything off the table. They want to create these events. But I think over the long term, how you start to even think about what events look like and how Netflix thinks about sports will change. And keep in mind, particularly for Netflix, once they decided they were going to have an ad-supported product, it almost becomes inevitable that you need sports, right? In some ways, that was the switch. Once they said they were going to have an ad-supported product, you can't do an ad-supported product at scale and make enough money off of those ad units if you don't have live events to drive that viewership. And I sadly, we've learned that news isn't going to do that. And award shows, you know, there's a tick here and there, but even those, the audience has gone down and they're so much more fragmented. And sports is fragmented in the sense of the platforms on which you can find it to watch it as a fan, which I have lots of thoughts about, but as a culturally relevant event to the largest number of people, certainly in this country and potentially globally, it's sports.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the advertising aspect, because that still feels very much like a thread that connects all the different, you know, when we're talking about broadcast networks from the 70s and 80s, cable in the 90s, and today's streamers. And that did seem to be the thing that maybe changed Netflix attitude, because you could have the same number of eyeballs on Squid Game, but it could be over 3 years, right? It's not a simultaneous audience.
Yeah.
I think Joe dropped off.
Did we lose Joe for a second?
Hopefully he can come back on. But have you been surprised by talking about the resilience and overriding importance of sport, but have you been surprised by the resilience of the ad model? Because it seemed like we were moving away from that. You know, I spent my career, or part of my career, in newspapers, and that's been a wrenching transition away from the advertising model to a subscription model. And yet now we see Netflix and Amazon saying, well, maybe we need football games because we want to grow our ad-based subscribers. Did you see that coming?
Look, I think there's always been this tension between subscription models and ad-supported models, and the pendulum can sort of swing, but I don't think it's ever going to swing away from ad-supported. I mean, look at Tubi, right? Like, Tubi's a really interesting case study outside of sports, although I guess they are going to have the Super Bowl this year. But, you know, that sort of model that looks a lot like, again, what free-to-air television looked like when you and I were kids, right? And the idea that you just kind of sit yourself down and there's content that's pushed at you. And I think one of the things, we all have fatigue right now. There's so much content. So there, and coming with that are so many different subscriptions, that there's a sense in which having an old model where content is pushed at you and you pay for it through your eyeballs in the sense of the ads, I think is having a bit of a renaissance, because we've tried the other model of all these different subscriptions and disaggregating all of the content. And that, it turns out, hasn't been particularly satisfying from a user perspective either. And so I think there are a lot of people who are willing to make that trade-off and say, look, I'll watch some ads in order to get access to content. And that's a trade-off I'm okay with. And I think maybe it speaks to sort of the heterogeneous user base, right? Like there isn't going to be one size fits all for how everyone wants to watch content. So having different models is helpful. And ultimately, the one that is going to reach the most people is probably going to be free and ad supported, right? Because those of us who may be willing to pay for a subscription to not have ads are also fine watching the Super Bowl with ads. And as we know, the Super Bowl is a particular outlier because we get excited about the ads. But then that in and of itself speaks to the power of the Super Bowl and the thoughtfulness of the advertisers. But I'm not surprised when you couple it with what this very subscription-driven ecosystem looks like with all of the fragmentation. And so I just think there's some exhaustion there.
Yeah, for the Super Bowl, you might have to pay more to access the ads, right?
Well, thanks to YouTube. And I should say I do a lot of work with YouTube. I did their Sunday ticket deal, so I'm very pro YouTube. But the fact is you can see all the ads on YouTube if that's all you want to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting how we're seeing tiers, across many of the platforms, and even in the podcasting universe. You can pay a premium to opt out of that subsidy that comes from advertising. And yeah, when it comes to live sport, I think even if I have the ad-free tier, I can't opt out of the ads on the Thursday Night Football on Amazon, or when Netflix had the games, and that speaks to sort of the how special live sport continues to be. So maybe our students and our audience would be really interested in getting a sense of what that was like for you. I take it you were representing YouTube going into that rights deal negotiation with the NFL, and I know there were probably other bidders, but there's a lot of talk about how the NFL, maybe unlike the other leagues, just has all of the leverage, right? They are kind of in a league of their own, if I can use that term, when it comes to the scale of their audience and their sort of cultural supremacy. So what is that like when you're on the media side dealing with the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and everything I'm going to say are things that have been publicly reported, so I'm not giving away anything I shouldn't. But, I think the NFL was really in an interesting position by the time, we got involved. They had about a year or so before we signed the YouTube deal, actually announced a deal with Apple. I don't know how many of you will recall that, but I think it was the fall of 2021. I mean, everybody knew that DirecTV wasn't going to be renewing. I mean, the product itself, they had sort of, DirecTV had ceased to really support. Some of you will remember outages on Sunday Ticket in their last year of having it. So everyone knew that the rights were up. And the NFL, I think, had signaled very publicly that they were looking, potentially for a streaming partner. I think they wanted the benefit of a technology platform that was really going to invest in the user experience, which I think YouTube hasn't done really well doing it. And so they had originally announced a deal with Apple in 2021, and it was public. And apparently they announced it before it was actually signed. And obviously it didn't move forward. So, by the time that we were engaged with the NFL, I think in some ways we probably had more leverage than was typical because of the timing. They were a season away from needing a new partner and didn't yet have a deal. So, and having been at the NBA for many years, I know very much what it's like to be on the league side. And since leaving the NBA, I've been more on the platform side, the people who are taking the rights. And it's an interesting dynamic. I think when you're dealing with these large tech companies, as much as we think about the balance of power being with the rights holder in the NFL in particular, when you have other businesses that make money, you can take it or leave it. Right. And I think it's one of the things that, when you think about long term from a league perspective, I don't know that they're ever going to throw all of their rights in on a streaming platform. because you want to create a robust market with multiple bidders, right? And if all of your bidders make most of their money doing something that doesn't involve your content, that's not a great long-term business model. And so as much as the NFL obviously has an amazing brand, amazing content, and a massive audience, they are negotiating against people who ultimately don't need their product for their businesses to thrive, because their business is much more than just their streaming work.
Right. So a CBS needs the NFL a lot more than Alphabet or Apple certainly do. Joe, good to see you back. Sorry for.
So I really apologize. My internet went kaput. So I'm having to log back in through my phone and the cellular network, and it's quite embarrassing because this doesn't usually happen. So
Well,
All right, I've been filibustering.
we're glad you could hop back on, and this is the issue with technology, right? It promises so much, and yet sometimes. But I wanted to ask you, Joe, about I think one of the things that was fascinating about Christmas Day, the Netflix deal with the NFL. I mean, there were a lot of things about it that felt unprecedented. Given the focus of what we do with the Great Game Lab and this course, the aspect of it that was most interesting to me was that here with one deal, you have the NFL with one broadcast, so to speak, in quotation marks, you were accessing 190, I think it's 190 some countries, right? Which really breaks away from the paradigm of leagues negotiating country by country rights deals. I think we saw that with Apple's deal with the MLS, which was a global rights deal. Now, that wasn't terribly disruptive because it wasn't like media outlets in Argentina or Germany were probably banging down the doors of the MLS, so there was a lot of space to do that. But for the NFL to be able to do this with Netflix, is this something we're going to see more of? Do you think the day might come when the English Premier League just decides to go straight to Apple, or is it going to continue to be in their interest to have sort of country by country auctions?
there's a lot I've got to unbundle from that question. I think the first is the appeal of different sports in different markets. It varies wildly, right? There are very few sports or sports events that have global appeal. Frankly, the English Premier League is one of them. And there's a lot happening around the English Premier League right now. I mean, if you followed it, there's actually a proposal in the new government to form a regulator to take a lot of money away from them, which will probably destroy a lot of what makes the English Premier League a unique league. I think the NFL deal with Netflix is somewhat unique, but it's not so much unique because it's global. It's sort of the first time that Netflix has dabbled into paying a real rights fee for a live event. Historically, Netflix has declined to do that and instead focused on doing peripheral sports programming, either reality shows. They did a WWE regular event now, but again, relatively cheap. They've done Drive to Survive, which helped launch Formula One into the US, but they don't have Formula One rights to show the actual races. I do think the dam has broken, or the Rubicon has been crossed, pick your favorite metaphor, and all of these streamers, including Netflix, will aggressively get into the rights business and the competition will increase. I think the challenge on the league side, and Sharon could talk about this better than I've done this a few times now with leagues, is you always have to balance reach and dollars. I have the only time I ever got into a fight with my friends at the MLS was over the Apple deal, because they went for this is a league that is emerging, it's growing, there's still new franchises being created, they're trying to build a fan base in the US. There is no fan base outside the US. And for them to go entirely on streaming, on a streaming service with very few subscribers. Remember, more people watched the CW last night than subscribed to Apple TV Plus. So I think it was a mistake. And even if you go back to pay television days, when I used to create regional sports networks, we would take baseball, seasons and we would put 120 games on the RSNs and 30 games on local broadcast to build a fan base. We would take basketball, 82 game season, 12 went to the national contract. We would put 15 to 20 games on local broadcast and put 50 on the RSNs. You always want to mix it up. NFL has done a great job of mixing it up. The NBA in its latest contract has obviously mixed up between streaming, actually gone back to broadcast, funny enough, which tells you something about the actual longevity and the staying power of broadcast, which is seeing ad dollars pretty much constant, down slightly, but constant compared to the complete and utter apocalypse that's happening in linear pay television right now. But I think every league and every IP owner has to balance reach and dollars, cultivate new fans, preserve the old fans, and maximize value. And I think that's sort of the trick. And every one of them faces a different challenge because some sports have appeal globally, some have no appeal globally. I think the NFL's attempts to get into Europe will fail. They will keep trying because they want to make it a global sport, but I don't think it will happen. You're seeing a lot happening in cricket right now. I created the IPL in India. We're creating this T20 league for the English Cricket Board in England. I created the Caribbean Cricket League. I think you'll see cricket become more of a global sport along different leagues, and that'll make it more exciting. I think women's sports is very exciting right now, especially women's soccer and a few other areas. I think those will have greater appeal on a global basis, done the right way. So there's a lot to globality, but fundamentally, I think it's country by country going forward.
Jack, I'm sorry, Joe, on that point, I wanted to ask you about, so Victoria Jackson, who is the co-director of our Great Game Lab faculty at ASU here, ask a question related to what you were just saying. Do women's professional sports leagues provide an opportunity to innovate and try new things, not being hamstrung by pressures of tradition? I think that's a good question for both of you.
In terms of their media deals, and Sharon should weigh in, I would say no. I think they're going to be trying to get the conventional media deals. And they will innovate in the same way that sports are innovating to be faster. You know, baseball is putting the runner on second base in extra innings and doing all these things to speed up the game. I think that will happen in every sport. I think in media, women's sports just need airtime. There was the WNBA was bundled into the latest NBA deals, and there was an allocation made by the NBA. I don't know what the WNBA would have gotten had it been separately, had the media rights separately been sold off. I think it'll be interesting to watch the NWSL. There's some other women's sports situations we're working on that I think will be exciting, but I think they just need to get in front of audience. They need to build a fan base.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, as Joe knows, mature leagues get the vast majority of their revenue from their media rights. And, by and large, women's sports leagues haven't yet crossed that, that divide to really being fully mature leagues. Even the W and Joe's right. And from my time at the NBA, especially on the digital side and also on the broadcast side, we were bundling the W rights in with the NBA, and that was how we drove value. And as Joe said, it's really an allocation that the NBA is making. And until women's sports get access to better audiences, and that's also things like day parts, right? It's not even just getting the deal, it's when are your games being shown? Are they being put in prime time so that you have access to the best audiences? And I think we're finding more and more that if you do put those games in good day parts, you will get the audiences, but the numbers aren't there from the licensing perspective. And so there's an opportunity to experiment in the sense that you may not have big, long-term, high-value media contracts, but that's not necessarily the end game, right? It's an opportunity to try new things as you're trying to prove out your case for where your audiences are and how to value them. But as leagues become more mature, they lean, more and more on their media rights for the bulk of that revenue. And I don't think that model changes for women's sports. I think there are ways to think about what else they do to round out their portfolios. And obviously sponsorship rights are always going to be really important, ticket sales, merchandise. And so those levers might be played with slightly differently depending on the maturity of the league, the market, as Joe says, like the nature of the content. But I wouldn't see that women's leagues are going to want to continue to be the petri dish. I think there'll always be some opportunities there. And I do think, Joe also alluded to this, and clearly I think this is true from my years at the NBA, that they tend to be more forward thinking, and their support of the W has really allowed it time to grow. And I think the NWSL, everyone lauded, the huge multiple that they got on their last television deals, but those numbers are still relatively small. And until those numbers get bigger, sure, there are opportunities to try things around the edges, but I'm not sure that fundamentally that changes the ultimate balance of the reach versus revenue that Joe talked about, and is always, if you're a rights holder, what you're battling. I tend to agree that the MLS deal isn't helping that league with reach. And they are still, a relatively nascent league from a fan perspective. And so, it's, if you build it, they will come. I don't know, it's a chicken and egg thing, right? You need the audience to justify the money,
Yeah.
but that platform gets you the audience.
I think part of the idea there was if you sign Messi, they will come, but maybe that was overstated. I know Victoria, who asked the question, is very excited to see what Netflix does with the Women's World Cup and programming around it. But I want to pull in one of our students to ask a question.
Andres, let me just mention, my internet's back, so I apologize again for that.
Yeah.
I will also tell you, having created the Miami soccer franchise and having helped the owners sign Messi, think about the extraordinary impact that had. He was struggling to build a stadium. It was one of the weakest franchises. It had been given away to David Beckham for free to induce him to play for the LA Galaxy 20 years ago. And there were a million challenges. Messi was nearing the end of his career. Frankly, we got him for a fraction. Miami got him for a fraction of what they could have paid for him potentially, and it probably tripled the value of the franchise.
Yeah.
For the owner.
Sure. Introduce yourself there.
Hello, I'm Derek Rivera, and just kind of sticking on talking about soccer. This summer, it's going to be the 2025 Club World Cup. And I think I was going to ask, do you think that's going to do a great job as far as bringing more popularity to the game of soccer in the United States?
Sharon, you want to start it? I'll weigh in.
Look, I think anytime you have an opportunity to have people watch content on and a lot of it has to do with the marketing that comes around it. Soccer has had a trajectory over the last, sort of generation of, hockey stick growth in this country. I think that comes from a lot of things. Part of it is more people playing the game, right? There's now like generations of people who grew up playing soccer, and not everyone who watches football played football, but I think a lot of people who watch soccer played soccer. And so I think it's a confluence of events, having premium events, having them played in your hometown, the ability to go see them live absolutely helps. But getting them on broadcast outlets, getting that broad distribution, marketing it, like it's incrementalism. But I certainly think that soccer continues to grow in this country. And I mean, my son is an EPL fan, like he's a Tottenham fan, and that's the only game that he will sit and watch from start to finish, professional sports. And he grew up going to a lot of NBA games, but that's the only thing he watches.
I'm an Arsenal fan, so clearly we didn't do sufficient betting here in terms of.
Well, I'll answer one thing just to say, I think what you both said is evidence that the MLS has a big problem. It is a second-tier league. They have a big salary cap. It was originally created by NFL owners to use their stadiums in the summertime. They play in the wrong season for soccer generally. And I think that the high-quality soccer is played outside of the United States. And it is difficult because U.S. soccer and the MLS doesn't want them playing regular season matches here in the U.S. I think the way to make soccer successful is to bring more of the top clubs into the U.S. for regular season matches and potentially figure out ways to elevate domestic soccer. It is one of many.
That was a dramatic cliffhanger. Not coming back, guys.
And I think that soccer will grow. You have the World Cup coming. I think you have in the U.S., and I think you have a lot of interesting opportunities for it. But I think we have to grapple with international soccer instead of domestic soccer as a way to boost the sport.
Yeah. Sharon, you mentioned earlier the fragmentation of audiences across so many streaming platforms. We're talking about English Premier League. I know that as an ardent Arsenal follower, I subscribe to, I think it's 4 streaming services that I otherwise would have no need for, because Netflix alone has more series and movies that I don't have time to watch. But if I want to watch Arsenal compete in Europe, I have to be on Paramount. If I want to watch them compete in some of the cups, I have to have ESPN Plus, and of course I have to have Peacock for the league. And this relates to a question from Joshua online. He writes, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the skinny sports bundles that have been launched by DirecTV and Xfinity, and about the coming ESPN flagship. Kind of related to this fragmentation, I feel like we're all trying to recreate the one basket, and let's not call it the cable bundle, but some, the next version of that's going to be maybe less chaotic. But are you optimistic about some of this experimentation that we're seeing, and what's going to come next? Any predictions?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think there's going to be a lot of experimentation. I think that's the right way to talk about it with these skinny bundles. And obviously, Fox just announced they're going to do some kind of sports and news skinny bundle. And I actually was doing work with Venue, so pour one out for Venue. Right up until they didn't launch, looked like maybe they were going to come back, and then obviously no longer. But I think it does speak to this fragmentation and how is it that we deliver to people what they want. And I think the biggest issue, there are many reasons why people didn't like the cable bundle, right? And I would actually argue a lot of it had to do with the technology and the customer service, right? For the traditional cable bundle. Because, and again, I've disclosed this, I'm a YouTube fan, I'm a YouTube TV fan, but I've often done a thought experiment with just people who don't work in the industry at all, just random friends, people I work with, people I meet at cocktail parties, and I say to them, if you could have one platform, and it was like, say, it was digitally accessible, you didn't need, a box or anything, and all of your content was there. You had a unified electronic programming guide. Once in a while, there might be something you had to pay extra for, a movie that just came out, maybe a boxing match, but by and large, all of your content was in one place. Would you pay $250 a month for that? And lots of people say yes, right? And so for those of us who, didn't maybe appreciate the cable bundle 20 years ago, it also subsidized, what you could say was the heyday of scripted television, right? Mad Men, at the time it was on, I think reached less than 1 million households on any given episode, right? But I think we would all agree that's a great show. AMC could produce it because they were being paid their affiliate fees for every household that wasn't watching Mad Men. So I think we're going to continue to be in this place of experimentation where we're bundling and unbundling content. And I think what the skinny bundles are talking about is a move towards rebundling, not this, like super bundle that we were used to that would have everything that cable once was. But the idea that the audience itself is fragmented. So one size fits all probably doesn't exist in the same way anymore. So how do we let people pick and choose? But because most of the programmers are still licensing content in a way that fits more with a traditional bundling model, right? I mean, like for DirecTV and Comcast to do these skinny bundles, and what the whole Venue lawsuit was about was the traditional bundling model where the programmer said, you have to take all of our channels and you have to pay for all of our channels, even if most of those nobody watches. And so part of, what the Venue lawsuit was about, and what you think about now, skinny bundles, which, DirecTV was the first one who got the rights to it because they were negotiating with Disney as it was coming, it was in the midst of the Venue lawsuit prior to the settlement. And so there has to be a different way that the programmers are willing to license the content for us to get to these skinny bundles. But even those skinny bundles, the distributor slash, like rights holder is picking what's in your bundle, right? But I think we've also learned if you totally unbundle everything, you're going to pay more. So we're in this, I would say we're in a place of evolution, and we are going to try a lot of things. We're going to try skinny bundles. We're going to try over the air. We're going to continue to do subscriptions. Netflix might add some more sports, event-based, or maybe, more of a longer tail or full season sport. And so I think we're still trying to figure out what the world looks like once we decided we didn't want the cable bundle, but I still think there's a big chunk of people who like the idea of a robust bundle. And then there are a lot of people who have a very limited set of content that they want to watch, but I think there's a bigger universe that they'd be willing to watch if it were easy and inexpensive.
You need to make this seminar 5 hours, Andres. You've got so many issues.
I know.
I mean, Sharon says, you know, this was always the famous issue around the cable bundle, right? Which is you're jamming channels down subscribers' throats that they don't watch, right? If Mad Men were on Netflix today, it would get canceled after the first season because it wouldn't hit their come close to hitting their algorithm for a successful show. And I can give you 100 other examples like that. But, you know, look at the situation today with MSG Network and in New York, which is having trouble on Altice. Ironically, I will tell you, back in '99, I created the Yes Network with the New York Yankees. And at the time, Cablevision Network, the cable systems had 5 million homes and an 8 million home DMA. They refused to carry it. And they said we were jamming them with too high a price, and how dare we force people who didn't care about the Yankees to watch, to pay for this network. Ironically, today, having sold their cable systems to a French buyer, the Dolan family owns the sports teams, and is now on the opposite side of the argument, saying that they want affiliate fees across all 5 million of the Altice subscribers. So the RSN battle, which is beginning to fade with streaming, is a big one. This whole issue of rebundling is a big one that a lot of people are facing. I think the Apple and Amazon dream is to rebundle. You can go on Amazon today and you can buy all sorts of other streaming services through the Amazon app. Apple wants nothing more than a return to the days of the iTunes store, where any content provider could put up a linear channel or a single show, and as long as Apple got 20%, the provider could charge anything they wanted for it. That's why Apple TV Plus will, in my view, always be a relatively small-time player. They're not very serious about competing as an independent streamer. They really just want to be a rebundler and benefit their technology and their software. And I think this is I mean, I don't know the answer, but I tend to think, like Sharon, the skinny bundles will have a harder and harder time when you actually challenge who's willing to pay for it and the rights fees involved. And if in all likelihood, people want rebundling, or they want a bigger bundle of content for the money they're paying, because you get more value for money when you do that. Otherwise, you end up in a situation you're in where you're paying 4 different providers to watch all the Arsenal matches.
On Apple, we just need them to keep pumping out those Severance episodes. I realize very few people are watching it, but boy, is it fantastic. Let's rapid fire have 2 more questions, and you all can react to them, whatever aspect of the questions intrigues you.
Hi, my name is Ash. I'm a social media gal, so I'm going to ask a question related to that. But in what ways have social media platforms reshaped the landscape of media rights negotiations, and how has this affected your approach to the deal? Has it helped you or hindered you?
And let's throw another one in.
Kind of similar to Ash.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jessica Poole. This is for Joe. I'm an MMA fighter, so I have to ask you about the merger between UFC and WWE. They have 2 very distinct business models. One is real competition, and another one is kind of scripted entertainment. So what made this merger an attractive deal, and how would you navigate the media rights of that merger?
Joe, why don't you go ahead and take that last question?
Sorry?
I was gonna say, go ahead and take the
Okay,
WMMA.
I'll take the last question, and then Sharon, you take the social media. Look, I think you have a couple of, it was a very, very interesting creation of a company. The funniest thing about it is now, because our crazy new president is a fan of all these combat sports, TKO has become a meme stock. But if you look at it originally, what happened was I sold UFC to a company called Endeavor, which had a whole series of different businesses, including a talent agency, Miss Universe contests, tennis tournaments, professional bull riders, a whole bunch of other things. When WWE was up for sale and we were on the WWE side of trying to sell it, you had an owner who was in legal and I would say had legal and ethical challenges because of past behavior. But he also had started the company a long time ago, so he had a very low tax basis. So the key for an owner like that is getting a very big cash deal and paying a lot of tax, or saying to the owner, you can own stock in a company, defer the tax, which is very valuable. And if the stock goes up, you get more money because you've not only deferred the tax, but you gain appreciation because there's a creation of equity value. So the idea of we came up with this idea for the Endeavor guys of carving out the UFC from Endeavor, combining it with WWE and creating a new public company. That enabled our client to get a tax-deferred stock transaction. There are enormous synergies in negotiating media rights that we'll do when Andres wants a 5-hour seminar. But the WWE rights, UFC rights, generally were running concurrent with each other. They were both businesses that started as pay-per-view businesses and began to dribble into linear, dribble into streaming, dribble into a whole variety of other things. The UFC and WWE each had their own form of dedicated streaming business. There's something called Fight Pass on the UFC side. They had deals with different networks. They had reality shows. They also had all kinds of events. So WWE Raw, for example, which has recently been licensed to Netflix, is a weekly year-round show. There's a lot of ways in which managing combat sports and events, dealing with the sponsors, dealing with the venues, there's a lot of synergies and commonality. So it was a very attractive proposition. And ironically, one of the great successes, not just because it became a meme stock because of Donald Trump's friendship with Dana, but effectively people swapped out of buying Endeavor into buying TKO. Endeavor became a very cheap stock, and the management ended up taking the company private. So Endeavor is no longer going to be a listed company at all, and many of those assets will get sold off. Other assets were contributed into TKO, but TKO is probably now the most attractive opportunity for public shareholders to buy into the thesis around sports and media and sports management, sponsorship, media rights, et cetera, along with very valuable global IP, because the UFC and WWE have events and fighters and contracts in virtually every country in the world, from India through Latin America, through South Asia, through China, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that's a good answer to your student's question, but I, again, could wax on. I don't know if Sharon, you want to touch on the social media question?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I think social media is interesting because it's incredibly important for leagues and athletes and fans to reach, athletes, teams, leagues to reach younger fans, right? One of the biggest problems that all of the major professional leagues have is an aging fan base. And, the NBA has the youngest fan base, and it's still on average in the early 40s, right? So for many people, social media is your strategy for reaching younger fans. The problem is you can't really monetize your live rights there, right? There isn't a business model. There isn't a willingness to pay the rights. I mean, Twitter tried some deals back in, the mid 2010s around actually licensing rights. The NBA had a deal with them. I think the NFL had a deal with them. They haven't figured out a way to make it profitable. And what currently is happening is you're having, commoditized highlights available on social media, and that's not really driving value directly to the rights holders in the sense of, licensing content. It obviously drives value from a brand building perspective. You hope those people ultimately do watch a game, they buy a ticket, they buy a jersey, they buy a shoe, they place a bet. And that happens to some degree. But if you continue to habituate younger fans to watching commoditized highlights on social platforms and not watch live game content, that live game content will lose its value over time, right? You need people in the live game window. whether they're on a small screen or a big screen. And I think that that's one of the things that traditionally people think about the living room experience as the most important one. And I think we would all argue that's the best way to watch a game. But a lot of people watch a lot of content on their phones. And how do we think about how a live experience translates into a smaller screen? And how do we think about that on a platform other than social, where you have maybe more of a direct relationship with your fan, you're getting more information from them, but also you're monetizing those rights better. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges going forward to continuing to maintain a legitimate, high value for live sports rights is what do we do about those fans that aren't as interested in sitting in front of a television and watching a whole game, live, and are willing to take, the highlights 30 seconds later from their favorite YouTube creator or on Snapchat or on TikTok. And I do think that's the question to be answered. The last actually job I had before I joined Perkins was as chief commercial officer of a startup called Buzzer. And I think we were probably about 2 years too early. But the idea was really, how can we help rights holders do a better job reaching younger fans who are on their mobile devices? And so it was a hyper personalized notification that you would get on your device after you told us what you were a fan of. You could be a fan of a team, a geography, an individual athlete. And if something was going on in a live game that we thought you cared about, we would send you a notification and you could click in. And for a micropayment, you could watch what we would call a live highlight. So depending on the deals that we had negotiated, a minute, 30 seconds, 5 minutes. Or if you had the right subscription, you could authenticate and watch as much of the game as you wanted. And the idea was you were getting people back into the live window. We were getting the direct data from them. We had really interesting metrics about people who had an overlap between PGA and Tour and the NHL, right? Not people you would think would have the same sort of fandom. And then taking that information, and we were willing to data share back with the rights holders or the platforms, and it could also be used as a way of lead generation for streaming services. And I still think it was a great idea, but getting those rights unlocked for what we essentially called, live mobile highlights. We're not trying to cannibalize people on a big screen. How do we engage them in the live window on a small screen? I think you still have to solve that. And right now, the social media platforms, they're not here to help you solve that.
I would add to Sharon, by the way. I mean, TikTok loves the idea of, and all these social media guys love the idea of paying absolutely nothing and capturing audience through having people uploading content and clips. And the question is, how do the IP owners monetize it? It was interesting in China, as an example, the NBA licensed all its media rights to Tencent for streaming. But when we did the deal with Tencent, we carved out anything less than 3 minutes. So we subsequently were able to do a pure short form licensing deal with a different provider. I would highlight something else aside from social media, which is really interesting in terms of second screen, which is the company today that claims to have the most data and most relevance to sports fans from a media standpoint is Electronic Arts, because their point is they have people playing the games and watching TV on a dual screen basis. They have the credit cards, they have the phone numbers, they know what players they like, they know what teams they like. So they think they're actually a media company, far more effective, far more comprehensive than any other of the big media companies that have packages of rights. And they pay much less in terms of rights fees to create these games and capture the audience. But again, it's sort of a little bit like the movie The Producers, because the next step is you've seen in sports gambling. So you have groups like DraftKings, which has the fantasy sports fans. You have Fanatics, which claims that it knows everything about you because it's got all the people who buy t-shirts and hats and kit, and therefore they have all the data on fans. And there's a lot of people claiming that they have all of the expert data about how to analyze and break down sports fans. And again, it just continues to make me feel that the sports ecosystem is going to grow in value because of the focus and the importance of that base and what the IP represents.
Thanks, Joe. And I'm so glad you mentioned Electronic Arts. We're talking about the growth of soccer in the U.S. And I think it's impossible to overstate how significant EA Sports and their FIFA game, now called FC Club, were in kind of naturalizing soccer as American. I do wish, Joe, this was the beginning of our second hour of our 5-hour session. Unfortunately, I'm sure you have other things to do. And I really want to thank you both for joining us. Maybe at some point we can do this again, but we'll continue to follow your amazing work. And thanks to everybody who connected online. I won't ask for Super Bowl predictions, but Sharon, I do think we need to have an intervention with your son. He's got to get off that top end. That's his
All
bad.
right, you can try. You can try.
But thank you so much.
Arsenal will never win the table. I root for nobody. I root for my clients first, but Arsenal will never win. This year it's Liverpool's table. Someday it will be Tottenham. Daniel and Joe will win. But
Arsenal wins the league. I'm going to come to LA and you're going to buy me dinner. Is that a deal?
I will happily do that. In fact,
Okay.
I have a lot of Arsenal fan friends in LA and London, and we will all go to dinner and celebrate together. Happy to
Okay.
do.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.